just seeing the trends out there that we have to bring in a bigger toolkit, and
Hmm.
a toolkit that is going to work in ways that our mind is opening to like shorten the suffering that people have when they're going through a healing journey and reversing a chronic illness.
Hey, this is Ari. Welcome back to the show. With me today, I believe for the third time, is Dr. Christine Schaffner, who is a board certified naturopathic doctor who has helped thousands of people recover from chronic or complex illnesses. Through online summits, her Spectrum of Health podcast, a network of Immanence Health clinics, and renowned online programs, Dr. Schaffner goes beyond biological medicine, pulling from all systems of medicine and healing modalities, helping patients reclaim their wellness and reveal their brightest light. So, with that said, we have a very interesting discussion in this episode, and she talks all about sort of the bioenergetic fields and the concept of coherence, of heart coherence and heart brain coherence, and broader coherence between the human organism and sort of all of the fields around us. And we'll talk about exactly what those terms mean. She'll talk about them, I should say. And there's a lot of fascinating, interesting, compelling insights in this podcast. And I think you'll get a lot of value from it, particularly if you're someone who's interested in exploring these kinds of outside the box approaches to human health and disease and bioenergetic medicine. So, with that said, enjoy this podcast with Dr. Christine Schaffner. Dr. Schaffner, welcome back to the show, I believe for the third time now.
Oh my goodness. Well, what do they say about three, right? Three is a charm. But no, I always love connecting with you, Ari, and I always learn a lot from you as well.
Likewise, my friend. So, you've been dealing with some of your own issues in the last year or two. You had a pituitary tumor. So, I would love for you to tell people about the journey you've gone on with that and what it's inspired in you as far as your interests in different fields of medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. I think we all have our own experience. And if I can help anybody else, through my experience, I feel like there's always greater purpose and meaning. And, I see patients, right? I see patients who are chronically ill. I've been doing this for over 13 years, and it's a whole different ballgame when you're in, the patient seat. And I had been going through some profound stress over, 2020, those kind of years, a lot of change. I was out on my own practice. There was a lot of business structural changes. I had a young daughter and, of course, all the things with COVID. And so there were some signs in my body that I just chalked up to like, well, my baby's not too old, all the things from recovering from a pregnancy to just life stress. So I could just easily like, okay, when the stress is over, I'm sure my body's going to be back in to normal. So I had some endocrine issues. I was struggling with amenorrhea. I also noticed that I had some lactation, even though I was not breastfeeding anymore. I also noticed that in my labs, my blood sugar was a little elevated, and I, eat healthy, and, I fast and all of that stuff. So it was very interesting to see like my hemoglobin A1C was even like 5.8 at one point. And I was like scratching my head. I was like, could this all be stress? And we have a desire to have another child. And my husband was like, Christy, we're not getting any younger. Why don't we go get checked out? Right. I'm like the worst patient. Right. And so I finally like dragged my feet. We decided to just go to a fertility doctor because I have some endocrine issues. And our goal, of course, is to have this second baby. And so she worked me up, and I knew she would eventually have me do an MRI. And I dragged my feet. I was like, okay, I'll get an MRI. But I was, again, the worst patient. And I maybe took 4 months from that meeting and that suggestion to get an MRI to get an MRI. And so what I ended up doing was finally getting an MRI in June of 2022. And you have those moments in life where you kind of feel like the pause button is getting like kind of like hit in your life and time slows down and you just know something is kind of in the air. I don't know if you have that ever had that experience, but
Sure.
I remember getting out of the MRI and the technician told me, when are you meeting with your doctor? And I thought that was like, oh, maybe he's just concerned about me following up. And, or, there was like a little bit of a quality like, huh. And so I just went on my day, and the next day I met with the doctor, and she was very kind of fumbling over her words. And she was like, Christine, like, you have like a large tumor in your pituitary. And I had to kind of stop her. I was like, do I have brain cancer or do I have like a, benign growth? And I finally got out of her. I had a quite large 3.2 centimeters. So imagine like the size of an egg, which is like very hard to imagine. And, the structure of your brain that was sitting in my sella turcica. So the pituitary sits in this very thin stalk in the middle of your brain. And it's protected by a bony prominence called the sella turcica. And so the tumor was basically taking up all of that space and starting to push against my pituitary that it had flattened it. And then in our anatomy in our brain, our eyes basically are hooked up to our optic nerves, right? And there's a crossing of the optic nerves that go back to the occipital part of our brain that controls our vision. And it's kind of right in the center, right around the pituitary, that this crossing happens called the optic chiasm. And the pituitary and the tumor was putting pressure on that optic chiasm that I had noticed. I don't drive a lot. I used to drive a ton, but my office is down the street. I walk to work. I have a little community here in Seattle where I can walk everywhere. And so I wasn't driving a lot, but I had noticed when I was down in California, I had rented a car and I was going out to drive at night, that everything was like very kind of blurry. And I thought like maybe my contacts had changed. And so that was another kind of curious note. And where the tumor was, it was putting pressure on my optic chiasm that it was affecting my vision, and it was affecting my field of vision and kind of the outer side. It's called the outer temporal region on both sides. So it was symmetrical. So I didn't really notice
Mm.
unless I got my eyes checked. And so I was like, okay, this is crazy. Like, I was here having this conversation. She was talking about brain surgery, having a tumor, and referring me to a neurosurgeon. And here I am. I do a lot of education on the brain. I do a lot of education on brain detoxification, the glymphatic system, the lymph channels of the brain. And here I am, being confronted that I am going to have to embark on neurosurgery. So then, a day later, the neurosurgeon's assistant calls me and I answer the phone. I like never answer the phone, but I was on my walk in the morning and I answered it, and it was like the assistant, and he was like, Christine, the neurosurgeon wants to talk to you before his day of surgery. I was like, okay, that's interesting, like a busy neurosurgeon, he wants to talk to me. So he was very nice, which was surprising. In all honesty, neurosurgery kind of gets a bad rap for rapport and everything. And he was very kind, and he said, Christine, like, this is, brain surgery, and this is quite a big tumor, and it's putting pressure on your optic chiasm and your risk of stroke. It's also secreting growth hormones, so it's affecting your blood pressure. It can shorten your life by 20 years. It can put you on risk of all of these, like cardiovascular disease, colon cancer, all of this. And, here I am, like a young mom, like listening to all of this. And he's like, but it's very curable. We just have to go through your nose and through your sinus passages and take out your tumor. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Wow, through
And
your nose, huh?
through your nose. So thank goodness. I mean, this is where you just have profound gratitude that there are people who study this and who've created technology and surgical techniques that they don't have to open up your brain, but they can
Yeah.
actually go through your nose. They use cameras basically to go up the nasal passages. And if you look at Google, you can do a cross section of the brain. And this is why a lot of times when I'm talking about the brain and when people are recovering from mold and all those things, they have a lot of cognitive issues because the sinuses, when they become moldy or infected, they secrete a lot of biotoxins, and the pituitary is not, far, from that. So that can create a lot of, hormonal symptoms with people with mold illness. And so, basically they went in and they drilled a hole in my sphenoid sinus and basically created an opening. That then on the other side of the sphenoid sinus is the bone, the sella turcica. And so this neurosurgeon does 400 of these a year, which I thought was pretty incredible. And in that moment, I knew I had to do this, and I was scheduled 2 weeks later. And part of the story is not only to kind of, hey, I have a ton of empathy and compassion for other people who are going through this. And when they're confronted with really tough medical decisions, especially when they're more naturally minded and they have to embark in the conventional world, like how to get resourced and to feel like you're on the right path, even though it might be a conflict of principles or kind of what you thought it was going to happen in your life. And so I want to share that again. I'm a naturopathic doctor who teaches brain talk study and, neurosurgery. And so, but I had, because of kind of this life stress, I had really kind of sought out kind of meditation. And through kind of a series of events, I started going to Dr. Joe Dispenza's meditations. And he's just kind of a modern day kind of vessel for, ancient wisdom and kind of modern like neuroscience and research to show kind of what's possible, when we use these principles that we're going to be talking about through our conversation today. And I was really touched by just that community. And then really like it's very commonplace in his retreats to hear stage 4 cancers, go away, for also people walk from wheelchairs, all sorts of things that, are seemingly like miracles, right? So I was, again, with my doctor hat, very curious of, how does this happen and how do people, heal from these things? And he says something, Ari, that just like really struck with me. And I felt like this, surgery was a testament to how I can embrace this principle. And he says to change matter with matter takes time. And I think we understand that, right? Functional medicine, bioregulatory medicine, naturopathic medicine. I know how to get somebody over Lyme disease, mold illness, neurological symptoms, but I'm frustrated. It takes a long time. They take 10 years to get diagnosed and then another maybe 3 years to really kind of get their life back, but still having to pay attention to their health. And then he said, when you change the field, you change matter. And I'm just like, what the heck does that mean? And I'm curious. And that's clearly a principle that he is teaching and people are ascribing to see these kind of what we would call miracles in modern science. And so I said to myself, well, I have this opportunity. Like, how can, I have 2 weeks to my surgery. Like, there's not really much I can do in the biochemical world. Well, I still, did those things. How can I employ some of these things that I had learned over the last year and a half in my own life? And so I embarked really on what I try to teach patients and what I try to, learn so I can share, but it was turning it inward. And so it was working with, what can seem esoteric or woo, but I'll share kind of the punchline of the story in a moment. That I worked with group healing. I worked with what we would call intention circles. I worked and did what we called coherence healings with Dr. Joe Dispenza's work. I worked with energy healers. I meditated daily and I visualized a positive outcome. I just want to be real. I did have my dark night of the soul and have that moment of terror and fear, like how anybody would if they were going to approach neurosurgery. But there was a moment, and I can remember it very clearly. I had a choice. I can walk through this experience with fear and insecurity and being scared and all of that, or I can walk through this other path of feeling empowered and resourced and to work with this realm that I had been studying and see how it impacts me. And so I really, I had like a final exam, in this work, in this lesson. And so I did this group intentions and group coherence healings. I worked with what we would call energy healers who just worked with my energy system and helped me to also visualize and believe a, good outcome could be possible. I also did, of course, acupuncture, and I did my IVs and I did my light therapy and all the things that I could do to prepare. And so I got through the surgery, and it's still like a rough recovery, and it was still like a whole thing, but I got through it, and I had a really good outcome. And I was at a university hospital, and so I donated part of my tumor for research. And so when I went to the follow up about a month later, Dr. Ferrara, kind of really at the end of our appointment and kind of in passing, I asked him about the pathology report and I said, "Can you tell me anything about this?" And he said, "You know what, Christine, like this is a really unique tumor. It has different cell types. And you know what I'm going to be studying your tumor for a long time. And what I really want to understand most of all is why it came out so much easier than other tumors that I take out." And to me, again, this is my experience, my story, but this validated in my being and in my essence that the work that we did, because we were visualizing like making it less sticky and easier to come out, and all of that, that all of that wasn't just to make me feel good and get ready for a surgery, but it had an impact. And I will be, studying this for a long time to try to really put words in a language and understanding, what happened and what Dr. Dispenza really means when you change the field, you change matter. But my curiosity has not only through my own experience, but it just continues to deepen to look beyond just the biochemical matrices that is within us and the biochemistry that's beautiful that we can manipulate, but to start looking at the field interactions within us and around us and that we bathe in every day, and have a language. Because I think what happens when we start talking about this, we can start saying, words, and we might not, be saying really what's happening. And then that can, make people more and more skeptical or just thinking that that's like a nice idea, but not really, grounded in this really deep body of work that is out there for people who want to read about it.
Mhm.
So that's my story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
So, I want to say on Joe Dispenza, I've tried on a couple occasions to kind of explore his work, and
yeah,
I never get very far because I
yeah,
find he plays a little too fast and loose with
yeah,
science, kind of
yeah,
mixing science and like spirituality and bridging the gap in a way that for me doesn't feel very fact-based, doesn't feel very scientific. I'm not saying it's wrong or that
yeah,
what he's saying is not true. I'm just saying for me, I need more connecting pieces to go
yeah.
from
And
this piece to this piece. And when I don't see that, it makes me skeptical. On the other
yeah,
hand, it's unquestionable. There's many people, you among many people, who certainly report amazing benefits from his methods.
yeah,
So, I have to believe that where there's smoke, there's fire. There's something good going on there.
yeah.
Um, so let's delve into it
Can
this
I
way,
can I comment on that for a second? And
please.
I
Yeah.
I think there is like we should all have healthy skepticism, of course, especially when we're educating others and also wanting to really guide people with, true knowledge and wisdom to get them, if you haven't had a health crisis, some of this can just seem, again, not apply to you, but, especially people who are so vulnerable in that place and they're looking for a roadmap and they're looking for a blueprint and they're looking for support and people are looking for a path out and that they can do it too, and, this body of work is available to people. I agree, like it's not going to resonate with everybody and everyone's going to have their own opinion. One thing that Dr. Dispenza is doing, which I admire, is that he is really voraciously studying subjects who go to his retreats and trying to understand what is happening. So I agree, like when we see things, especially, I'm sure he sees things before he had a language or the research to back what he was seeing and why he was seeing it. And that can sometimes feel, as you said, not as grounded as you'd like. However, the research is starting to talk about, these really profound epigenetic changes and these changes in hormones and the microbiome and all of the stuff that happens when people go into these really deep meditative states for 7 days, which is a luxury to a lot of people, but it's possible. So I believe there's something emerging and continuing to emerge out of that body of work, but it's fluid and it's dynamic and it's not perfect at all.
Yeah.
And I just always err with caution. you have to find what's going to be the path that speaks to you and that works to you with you, because if you have doubt or not alignment with that, it's going to be hard for those principles or that, like that, those meditations or those retreats to really work to the fullest of their ability for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that Joe Dispenza does is kind of, he'll talk about brain scans and neurofeedback and EEG recordings of people's brains and that sort of thing. And then it sort of flows seamlessly into talk of the field and
Yes.
consciousness, and how the field or the quantum field sort of is interacting with physical matter.
Yeah.
And that, like, I feel like the way he talks about those things,
Yeah.
I think, and I have many friends in the space who are neuroscientists who definitely share my perceptions of this. Most neuroscientists would not agree with kind of the way he portrays those things, not in the sense that he's saying something incorrect, but
Yeah.
in the sense that he's saying things that he's sort of blending science and spirituality in a way that is like he's portraying it as the science, as
Mhm.
that this is all grounded in science, and all the scientists agree that this is the case, but he's kind of
Yeah.
greatly stepping out of actually the realm of neuroscience and more into the realm of spirituality and philosophy, while
Mhm.
sort of almost implying like he's seeing those things on the brain scans. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think, all of your opinions and your feedback is valid, and especially for your community to like be really cautious and, really, I would always encourage people to have their own experience and like, really, formulate their own opinion and narrative of everything we're saying, even, but I think the rub is how do we make sense of these things that are happening, right?
yeah,
And there's a premise which could be more spirituality, but there is a scientific body of work to talk about the zero point field, the quantum field, the field that surrounds us, right? And these are people, again, I don't pretend to be a, physicist in this way, but I read about this and I'm curious. And I think there's some, especially when somebody who's looking at the healing arts, right? Like, wow, if there's a sea of unlimited potential around us, why do, like how do we access this for healing? Again, I'm thinking about it for that lens, not for manifesting or whatever. I'm thinking about healing, right? And so if there is this highly charged field of communication, connection, and as they describe it, unification and potential, if we can dance with that or interact with that just in some way, does that offer a potential for like basically more energy for the living system to do what it knows how to do already, so
yeah,
it's a thought and it's an exploration, and I don't think anyone holds the answers, but I'm definitely like trying to read and stay curious with this conversation because it's
absolutely.
yeah, I think it's the future, but um, I think there's a future here, but again, we're just in the infancy of understanding, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah. And I totally agree with all of your sentiments on that. I think that's a good way of phrasing it. And to some extent, all I'm really asking for is for him to speak with the kind of nuance that you just did. That would be enough for me.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's what eventually gets me skeptical is when people are portraying more speculative things as known sort of scientific consensus, as known facts, and as undebatable findings.
yeah.
And
I think
when there isn't
that's
a distinction
yeah,
between, hey, this is what we know, and we speculate that this and this might be going on, but we don't know, we can't know. The current body of knowledge and evidence doesn't allow us to know. But so it's a matter of style more than anything, but
yeah,
nothing.
yeah, yeah,
None of my criticisms. At the same time, the very things that make me skeptical of him
yeah,
are, I think, the same. It's the same style that actually makes him effective in
yeah,
convincing lots of people, is to
yes,
not speak
yes,
with the kind of nuance that would appeal to someone like me, But to
Yeah,
portray it as something that this is known, this is fact, this is what we see in our laboratory, all the scientists agree that this is what's going on, I think makes it more compelling and convincing for someone who doesn't have a scientific background, to,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I applaud. Maybe it's intentional. Maybe he just does that as a matter
Well,
of
the
trade-offs.
the
And
power of the mind, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
So
So,
yeah.
having said that, and being totally open, you're obviously totally open, and I'm open also to the possibility that what he's doing is really truly effective, and that the science just hasn't totally caught up to it yet. Um, let's explore sort of piece by piece. So, first of all, what is the field, and what does it mean to talk about how interacting with the field might change matter?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I encourage people. I really love the book, The Field, by Lynn McTaggart. She's also kind of a thought leader out there, but she's an investigative journalist, so writes from that kind of lens. And she summarizes a lot of kind of the science that has gotten people to understand from everything from consciousness to biophotons to this idea of the field. So I love that book if people want to kind of go deeper into this conversation. So when my understanding of the field, again, I'm a student of this as well, is that there's this conversation, right, in space, right, that space is this empty vacuum, and that there's only kind of a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that we experience in this space that we live in Earth. And there's kind of this opposite conversation happening in science right now. There's also, I believe, when we talk about the field, the people who are talking about the electric universe kind of go there. There's kind of a dance between these like ideas, and the electric universe kind of makes a little bit more sense. I can grab onto that a little bit more. And it's this idea that space is not an empty vacuum. There is this idea that Tesla also was known to have conversations around, because he was exploring it as well. And Max Planck was exploring the 0 point field, and Tesla was calling it the luminiferous ether, kind of this medium which all waves of life are traveling through. And so it's this field of what we would say and kind of modern, for lack of a better word, but it is quantum physics to, look at this. And it's this idea that this field is touching. It's a fabric of life. It's a fabric of space, and it's interconnecting with all of life and all of matter. And it's basically how two coordinates from basically very far distances can still be in conversation together through principles. Again, I'm a student of these things, but quantum entanglement, and how we can see again, there are people in even our government who study, telepathy, and how there's, consciousness interactions between large distances, right? So it's this idea that maybe this fabric that connects us all, that's full of electricity and charge and plasma and ether, basically is part of the conversation. So these different types of matter, ether is what's called the fifth state of matter, and plasma is more the fourth state of matter. And it's these different densities and different forms of all of the same thing. So it's this kind of really lovely idea of this unification of life, which, again, if you're into consciousness and you're into exploring the healing arts, we gravitate to this, because again, we're looking at like, how do we access something bigger, and not necessarily God or the divine, even though these can be synonymous, for more information and more um, basically energy. I'll just say more information and energy to interact with for a positive net effect. And so that is kind of my dance with understanding. And then when we kind of look at the human body, I think it's a little bit more easier, right? So we know that we have field interactions within us and around us. So this is, conventional science, right? So again, there are principles of physics. Whenever we have an electrical charge moving through a conductor, we create a magnetic field. And whenever we have a magnetic field, we create an electric field. So it's kind of this these paired fields that always travel together. And we are full of charges, right? We're full of, basically these charged electrolytes and elements in the body that move through different medium, blood, the fascia, different fluids. And when they're moving, these charges create electricity, again, moving through these conductors that create magnetic fields. So all of a sudden you see like these electromagnetic fields that are also moving through our body. We know, again, a big part of the work that I'm doing with Dr. McCready and the summit that we created was to really understand the heart, and this really beautiful idea that the heart has a very strong electromagnetic field that we generate through the basically the electricity that's being generated through the blood that's creating magnetism, that is a measurable electrical current and a magnetic field that is generated from the heart. Again, this is very measurable. We use the EKG and then devices that pick up the magnetic field to measure the heart. We know we have these electromagnetic fields in the brain as well. What's really interesting and fascinating, we can go deeper in, is that the heart is the strongest electromagnetic field in the body that it generates, and it's stronger than the brain. And we can go into these ideas of when there's a coherent heart rate variability and heart rhythm, what that entrains in the brain and the rest of the body. That's something that I'm very curious and fascinated about. And then there is a modern day term called the biofield. And this is not just the aura or esoteric science. I mean, you can go into PubMed and see people who are trying to put in, science between this, around this idea that, again, I can just say, that we have a field around us from our heart and our brain and the electromagnetism in our, that I just shared that's emanating from us. But there's this idea that it's not just an emanation, but there is the field that we come into life with. That's called the biofield, that is electromagnetic in nature, also a summation of the light energy that we emit. That's Fritz Albert Popp's work, and the idea that we communicate with light in ourselves as well, and biophotonic energy. So we're emanating and communicating with that. And then they make room when you read in PubMed and people are studying in the biofield, they make room and they kind of, give a blanket turn to it also includes the subtle energy, which again might just be ancient wisdom or, philosophical. And, people are trying to understand and study this. And some liken it to plasma, this plasma state, some liken it to, in naturopathic medicine, we're very philosophical and we call it the vital force, and this, vitality, this energy that's clearly here when you're alive and clearly not here when you're dead, right? And, what is all of that, right? So the biofield, in my kind of way that I've like constructed my own narrative and model within, the electrical systems in the body. I don't want to leave out the fascia. I think the fascia gets left out a ton when we talk about electromagnetism. And I, being a naturopath and somebody interested in bioregulatory medicine, I think the fascia, there is a lot to discover about its ability to communicate within this body-wide network of the living being, that almost could be faster than the nervous system in some instances. And it's this beautiful communication network. It also bathes our cells with this plasma state of water. When we walk and we move, we generate what's called a piezoelectric effect, where we generate electricity in this electromagnetic current. I look at, the fascia also when it gets injured. I do a lot of scar therapy in my office, and there's this whole idea when we have scars in our body, which are necessary, and thank God our body knows how to make them. Um, that scar tissue doesn't look like the beautiful fabric of our original fascia, but it's a plug. It's a denser, it's more irregular, it's less fluid and mobile, and it creates almost a traffic jam in that area of the fascial network that can create electrical and communicative changes over time. So clinically, real quick, I know I'm taking on a side, but I always think the fascia is left out, and I'm like so curious about it. And I think it's part of our electrical magnetic system, and it's a big part of this conversation.
How would
That
you distinguish between the fascia and the extracellular matrix?
Yeah, it's all kind of, again, like the unified field out there. It's kind of inside of us. They're kind of these different layers that are different names. So we have the fascia is kind of the umbrella term, I would say. It is the connective tissue that is wrapping our muscles, but also the spaces in between us. And I also refer to the work of Dr. Jean-Claude Gimberto and the structure that he has shared through his you can go on YouTube and see his basically videoing of hand surgeries where he takes kind of the blood out and kind of looks at the fascia. Because, in cadaver lab, you just cut through the fascia and you think, oh, it's just structural. You don't think of it in this communicative way. And so he really has opened my mind also to the fascia. I read his book, The Architecture of Living Fascia, in like a day, actually, when I was recovering, from my surgery. I was like, oh my God, I finally have time to read the books I want. And it was just beautiful. And so the fascia is kind of this umbrella, term, and within the fascia is the lymphatic system. And within the lymphatic system, we are draining the interstitial fluid out of the extracellular matrix. So you can kind of think of like the minutia, the space in between our cells is the extracellular matrix. That fluid that is bathing our cells is interstitial fluid or pre-lymph, and then lymphatic capillaries, so basically draining that fluid and putting it into the lymphatic network. And then the lymphatic network and the fascia network actually move together. And the fascia, the movement that the fascia generates helps to also move the lymph. And so we love to study anatomy, right? And anatomy, there's systems and there's compartments and there's, different, like the nerves are yellow, the, blood is red, the, veins are blue, and the lymph is green. We like to think about the body that way. But it's this continuum of, different spaces that all communicate. And really, at the end of the day, Ari, what I find is that when there is this fluid conversation and communication that's really happening in the body, and the body's coordinated as a whole system, and this is this conversation around coherence, that's where we see health and connection, and this is where healing happens. And then when we see this isolation, compartmentalization, decoherence, that's where we see like entropy or disorder or chaos or senescence or cancer, in the body. So we look at the body, the more that it can be kind of communicating as a whole system and conversation with all parts of itself, which I believe the fascial network that I just described is a big part of that communication network in the body. And so, that's kind of that piece. So I kind of laid out this conversation of like, okay, we have this electrical system touching all parts of our cells through the fascia. We have, light being emitted from our cells through this conversation of biophotons. We have electromagnetic energy throughout our body, but there's the big generator through our heart and through our brain. And that summation is kind of this field around us. And then there's this whole other kind of inquiry, I would say, at this time about maybe this field is always around us, whether we're emanating it or not, so I don't know. I'm just reading about it. And that bathes in the larger field of, the unified field. And the more that we can get lined up with that, the more maybe we have access to this greater information that is available to us while we're living in these human bodies.
That was very well explained.
Thank you.
One of the things that I do is, I'm kind of the way my brain works. It's always been very, very macro focused. I am, some people have this mindset where they want to dig into all the very complicated details of biochemistry and different genetic mutations and, all the different possible variations, and they'll spend
Yeah,
years or decades just
totally.
immersed in this infinite complexity, complexity that is evolving so fast that no human can even possibly understand it as fast as it's evolving.
Yeah,
Um, and my brain has always looked for what's going on at the big picture. What's the macro level view here? So, for one, I'm very focused on the fact that the vast majority of the chronic disease burden, most of the major killers that kill most people are chronic diseases of aging, which are diseases of civilization. They're diseases of nutrition and lifestyle. And so the proper paradigm, in my view, to understand most of what's going on there is an evolutionary paradigm that understands what human biology evolved to need and what the gaps are, what's going on, the mismatch in the modern world that is not providing what our biology needs, and thus we have all this massive epidemic and huge burden of all these chronic diseases that essentially don't exist in traditional living human populations. So to me, that's where my focus is, certainly. When you're dealing with people who have disease, then you go down a path that is about understanding the complicated nature of how do I understand what's going on in this particular person in front of me and help them figure out, their individual needs and reverse this condition, ideally. But I've always been fascinated just on the paradigm level, that there are, if we look at the big picture and the historical view, there are humans throughout history who have come up with different paradigms, different worldviews, and belief systems and philosophies and approaches to human health and understanding disease and how do we be healthy. Everything from ancient Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine that's focused on chakras and energy systems in the body and meridians and acupuncture points and herbs that are interacting with the different yin and yang energies of the body and these kinds of paradigms, or the doshas of Ayurveda. The ancient Greeks had a system that was based on the four humors, I think the four or five humors. And there are many other systems, and obviously many, probably hundreds or thousands more that are smaller and much less well known. And we have the modern medical system, which most of the population has been indoctrinated to believe is the scientific approach. And that approach really is to study disease, to study the mechanisms of different diseases, and to spend decades, for example, studying the mechanisms of what's going on in the brain in a person with Alzheimer's, or what's going on in the brain with chemicals in the person who's depressed, or what's going on in the blood vessels of somebody who gets coronary atherosclerosis, or why does somebody get high blood pressure, or what's the mechanisms of liver disease, what are the mechanisms of stroke, what are the mechanisms of you name it. It goes down the path of spending hundreds of billions of dollars in laboratories studying the mechanisms of all these diseases that are killing us. And then out of that, they go into a chemistry laboratory and they synthesize man-made chemicals, which are designed to be molecules that target whatever mechanisms they found in the research around the mechanisms of disease, so that you develop a chemical that's designed to change the chemical balance of your brain from a depressed state to a non-depressed state, or to, if amyloid plaques are causing Alzheimer's, to develop a drug that blocks the formation of amyloid plaques. Or something like, cholesterol, LDL is linked with atherosclerosis. Let's develop a drug to inhibit the levels of LDL cholesterol in the blood, and so on. Which, based on my lens, an evolutionary lens, makes very little sense, and is, to say the least, in very gentle terms, it makes no sense actually from that perspective. It's a very bizarre approach. It was successful in the antibiotic revolution in combating some bacterial diseases, and sort of it got extended to all these other diseases based on that. But it doesn't work in all these other diseases. It works really only in the context of, where there's a clear bad guy in the body. You take a chemical that kills the bad guy, it cures the disease. But most diseases are not like that. So anyway, all of this is to say that just understanding the big picture context, there are different paradigms, different ways of thinking about disease and about health, and different approaches that come out of that. This is an interesting one, what you're presenting here.
Mm.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how it links up to an evolutionary view. Why would what is sort of the evolutionary context around this
Mhm.
field that exists and the different energetic fields or bioelectrical fields that exist in the human bodies? Is it possible to ground this in any kind of evolutionary context?
I might not answer your question right away, but I'd love to dialogue about this. And I feel like I agree with you. I think the biochemical kind of really myopic, microscopic, very single mechanistic view of the human body is very limited and short-lived, and often doesn't lead to true cure or true transformation for the human body, right? And so I really believe a lot of my curiosity is we're emerging into another paradigm that wants to emerge in how we look at health, and it's needed. And the evolutionary perspective, I think, is very rooted in it. It really investigates, how we relate to our environment and to society and to our, how we're evolving through these times. And what I can say, Ari, is by, doing this work with patients, people are really, really sick. And modern life is extremely stressful to the point that like I don't even know how many chemicals a newborn is born into at this point. I knew the data from 2005. I can only imagine
Yeah, it was
2020.
around 400 detectable ones, but who knows how
Yeah,
many were even there that they
yeah,
didn't even test for. Yeah.
yeah, right. And then the synergistic approach and all of that. And it might be like I'm a very optimistic person, and it just might be my optimism. So I have to share I'm biased in that way. But I believe it is getting almost so challenging to tinker with every toxicant and every pathogen and every kind of burden that is within the human body right now. I believe we're at this like tipping point that life is just chronic diseases on the rise, not only in our population, and of course there's many reasons for this, but also our children, fertility is on the decline. There's all of these signals, right, that this is not working. And we can just relate that to food and the environment and too many people doing conventional medicine. But the way I look at the body is through the lens of, the environmental impact and, how that impacts the immune system and then in our emotional state. And of course, this conversation. So there's part of me that feels that we have to start looking at this part of how we are wired to interact with life, because it could actually be a more elegant path for us to overcome the challenges of modern time. Again, this is just a thought and like a philosophical thought, but it is, I've seen glimpses of it. I saw stage 4 cancer completely heal in front of my own eyes through principles of coherence and healing and all that esoteric craziness. I saw it happen. And stage 4 cancer is a very hard disease, right? It's chemo, it's radiation if you ascribe to that, or complete nutritional change, or complete emotional healing, or whatever. Or it's a group of people coming together to like try to create change in your body, accessing something maybe more powerful than any of those tools combined, right? And again, it's just an observation and a thought. And I have had glimpses when people, I'm pointing to my treatment table over there, when people start kind of working with these layers and beginning to see themselves as something bigger and having access to this bigger kind of toolkit of healing, things start to heal that. And if I just looked at my functional medicine naturopathic lens, would be, take too long, right? We got to get every heavy metal to this threshold for the body to then have less neurotoxicants, and then the neurological symptoms can go away and blah, blah, blah. I just feel like if we just stay in that paradigm, it's going to be very frustrating and very, like, unfortunately limited until we can get our act together as stewards of the planet and change our food system and our societal systems and all of that. So again, I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, but I believe like why I'm trying to tune into this in my own journey, not only for myself, but for my patients, and just seeing the trends out there, that we have to bring in a bigger toolkit, and
Hmm.
a toolkit that is going to work in ways that our mind is opening to like shorten the suffering that people have when they're going through a healing journey and reversing a chronic illness. So
Hmm.
that's just really kind of my insight right now. And so I think we're evolutionary because we're at a tipping point of how toxic people are, and how, just the earth is, and how we are interacting with it, that we have to really find another way to help reverse all of this. And from that place, we can make the changes, and maybe even get inspired on how we be better stewards and reverse some of the damage we've done to our soil and so forth.
Yeah, agreed. Um, so let's talk about coherence
Yeah,
specifically. Let's talk
yeah,
about what exactly it is, and what is the sort of paradigm around how we get it and how we lose it.
yeah, absolutely. So through my study of all of this, I land on a principle often when I'm reading around biophysics or quantum, physics or quantum biology, which is an emerging field, or, the light interactions in the body, or even like looking at sound and how we communicate with sound. There's this kind of theme of coherence. And kind of from an overview, kind of macro level, coherence can be synonymous with alignment, harmony, order. It is when basically two oscillating systems are synchronized. So all of those kind of wave, kind of field interactions that I described in the body is when there is some coordination and synchronization between them that exchanges energy and information for something greater, right? So it's constructive, right? And so when we think about coherence in the human body, and why when I did the summit, I was really excited to do this with Dr. Roland McCready, who's been like a really big inspiration and thought leader for me and for this body of work he's done with heart math. And he's really applied complex science to understanding these principles that are quite simplistic when you look at them from a macro level. And when we look at the heart, so a heart math obviously is really surrounded and geared to understanding the heart, and how the heart generates coherence, and how that creates greater order within the human body, especially the nervous system. And um, many of your audience like knows about heart rate variability, but there's no two beats of the heart that are alike. That every time our heart beats, there's kind of a change, and this change that variability can be measured between the time interval between those beats. And what we've learned through the study of HRV is that the more variability and flexibility in the heart, it has a lot of basically assumptions that lead to like there's less aging in the body, more mental and nervous system flexibility. There's more ability to engage the parasympathetic nervous system. It's a sign of health to have this more variable heart rhythm. And what Dr. McCready started to understand is how our emotional state can modulate that variability and can change the order, basically the when I say order, the organization of those heartbeats to be in what we call a more coherent heart rate rhythm. So what that looks like in math is what's like a beautiful sine wave, so like this beautiful kind of very organized wave. And he noticed that when people are in these states of, like, again, it's very like Pollyanna view of life, but it's really what our physiology does, is when we're in these states of gratitude, love, appreciation, we can generate and modulate our heart rate variability to be in this more coherent heart rhythm pattern. And if you go back to kind of my conversation, if the heart is the strongest electromagnetic field generator in the human body, and this principle of coherence, when there's more basically order, that leads to more synchronization between other, like it's almost like the more ordered wave kind of brings the other disordered waves along and get them entrained to create more order and more synchronization, which leads to more information exchange and more like health, just on a very broad term. So they studied the opposite, right? And they studied like, okay, when people are in these states of frustration, anger, anxiety, fear, we're in this very erratic pattern in our heart. And that creates more like disorder, desynchronization, less communication between systems, more, everyone's kind of vying for themselves. And we're human, we have to feel those feelings. I'm not saying you can never have a fear-based thought or an anxiety ridden thought, but just to understand, right, what it does to your physiology. And when you're in maybe really stressful times in your life, making sure that you like tend to your heart, like even for 5 minutes a day, and even try to induce those states to kind of balance out the stressful periods that you're going in. And then this whole other story emerges between the heart and the brain. And I learned a lot through Dr. McCready's work, and his education, that the heart, actually, there's more information going from the heart to the brain than the brain to the heart, which is, that's curious to me. I don't know to you, but when I learned that, I was like,
Yeah.
wow. And there's this whole basically electrical system and nervous system in the heart. There's about they call them sensory neurites. So these neurons, it's almost like a little mini brain in the heart, and there are 40,000 sensory neurites in the heart that basically communicate this information that gets generated throughout the body. And then there's also afferent nervous system connections. So that means nerve signaling, that the main highway of the nerve goes from the heart to the brain rather than the brain to the heart. And there is a connection right into that limbic brain, the amygdala. And so all of a sudden, we talk a lot about the amygdala, limbic retraining, and chronic illness, and how to get people out of their trauma and their fear states and their patterning because of, unfortunate life circumstances, that there's a repetitive part of the brain that's kind of creating this stuck information, just on a macro level, that can get people stuck emotionally or physically. And so all of a sudden you start to think about, okay, if I can, tend to my heart and create these emotional states, I can create more order, that's getting basically signaled out, in the field of my body. And that's in training, basically my brain waves, my nervous system. And then I'm gonna, I made something up that could be real or not, but I like, why not? It's in training the fascia. The fascia communicates with all of this, and that's probably carrying and sustaining that signal and that feeling within the body. So I kind of start, playing around with that idea. So all of a sudden there's more order, more organization, more alignment, more harmony in the body. And so, again, that's a state for healing, right? So when we're engaging that state, we're also engaging our parasympathetic nervous system. And there's a lot of just like downstream physiological benefits, right? So more heart rate variability leads to more neuronal synchronization and organization amongst brain waves, more relaxation in the nervous system and the parasympathetic. And then I think about it, it's all of this, because there's not all these conversations happening in the body, that there's like this synchronization and organization. There's more energy for healing, right? And so the body can, do the work, or, feed those areas of the body that are needing support. And so I look at this as a really beautiful way that we're wired to generate a healing response within us. And it feels good. I mean, if you're into consciousness and mind body states, it's going to be a state that feels better than the opposite of that
Yeah.
as well. So
Yeah. Um, can you briefly describe the connection between heart rate variability and coherence? Are they essentially, in a way, almost synonymous? Meaning, if you're in a state of high heart rate variability, are you also in coherence, or are they almost
yes.
synonymous? Or
Yeah, there's a pattern that emerges when you have more variability that also coincides with an emotional state. That's the research that shows that, basically, again, you can have high heart rate variability and flexibility because you're just taking care of your body and you're healthy and, you're doing all these wonderful things. That's a measurement of health on a lot of levels. But there's a mathematical patterning that happens that is labeled. This is again in Roland's research papers and methods that you can read, but it's basically this. It really corresponds in the research I've done with emotions match with this high variability. So that is coherence. There is a mathematical frequency of zero point 0.1 hertz. So every 10 seconds, that sine wave kind of moving, that frequency is a measurement of like a cycle per unit of time. So there's a cycle every 10 seconds. And not to jump ahead, but there's kind of this wild thing that, again, this is all Roland's research that he taught me, that the magnetic field lines in the earth, they're called field line resonances. When they're in kind of a resting state in their resonant frequency, they're also at zero point 0.1 hertz. So all of a sudden, there's this conversation that Roland is having with his global coherence initiative of, how the field resonance lines of the earth impact our like basically field line resonances within our body, and the more out of sync earth is, sometimes we can be out of sync, and the more out of sync we are, the field responds. And Roland often says this thing, what you feed the field matters. And I sit with that. I try to understand that, trust me. But he has basically these magnetic sensors all over the world that they measure what's going on with these lines, and how they do experiments, so they see how like solar activity basically impacts these lines, and these, kind of basically get it out of its resonant, frequencies. And if you're in an office with chronic illness, the moon cycle and, solar flares and how they impact the body, even without even knowing anything about it. People have more symptoms, they call you more, all of that. So there's this conversation, when we're out of tune more, with the larger ecosystem, that can impact us unless we're mindful and tending to our own inner coherence, right? Our goal is, what I always say about health is that health is all about creating a resilient system. We live in modern day, we're not in utopia. Like, so how do we just weather these storms? And I believe this conversation we're having is a really beautiful way to weather that. So I went on a diatribe, but basically the heart rate variability when it's in a coherent state is in that, zero point 0.1 hertz, is the, basically the sine wave that is generated, and that's modulated by emotional states.
Mm-hmm. And 0.1 hertz is 1 per second, 1 cycle per second, right? So point
Yes,
one is 10 cycles. No, it's
every 10 seconds. Yeah.
right.
So it's a
It's
cycle every 10
one
seconds,
cycle every 10 seconds. Yeah,
like a tenth. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So okay, so
I think it's
that's not a reflection of the actual rate of heartbeats. It's a reflection of
no,
sine
it's
wave.
different. Yeah, yeah. So the sine wave is basically the heart rhythm pattern, which relates to heart rate variability. The heart rate can be, the heart rate is the variability, right? So there's a heartbeat here, there's a heartbeat there, there's a heartbeat here. What is the time interval between that? That's what's creating the mathematical measurements. Does
Right.
that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So, with the part that's counterintuitive for most people is we would assume that more variability in the time intervals between beats would probably be a bad thing.
totally.
We most people I think would intuitively assume that very regular heartbeats
Yeah,
that don't vary in their time intervals would probably be a sign of health. But interestingly, it's the opposite. It's having variability. When you're in a very stressed state and overwhelmed and disease state, the heart becomes very regular, boop, 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 boop,
yeah.
without a lot of variability between beats and a lot of flexibility and resilience of that
Totally.
system. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Roland taught me that was what science thought, like even within 30 years, like the heart was a metrodome. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like it was just this steadiness. And in bioregulatory medicine, we used to say something like somebody has rigid regulation when they're like in a very like disease state, their body can't respond and adapt and it isn't resilient. And that kind of, illustrates, I think, the heart rate variability idea, like, less variability, more rigidity, less flexibility, and their
Right.
ability to respond, to, treatments and things.
Yeah. Okay, my last question to you
Yeah.
is, okay, so we've I think you've built out this paradigm, this understanding that, there's sort of an external field that we're all swimming in. We have these internal fields. There's coherence potentially on a number of different levels, coherence within our own internal systems, coherence between us sort of at the organism level and the broader environment, and
Mhm.
that these could be or are playing a significant role in health and disease.
Mhm.
So with that paradigm built out, what do we do? What do we
Yeah.
do to practically affect this? So let's maybe end, and I know that that could be like a multi-hour long discussion
Yeah.
in and of itself, but maybe leave people with, I don't know, two or three ideas of things that they can start to play with to start to experiment in their own body and their own lifestyle with ways to increase coherence and see if they notice benefits from it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, there's so many ways, and that's the whole goal of the summit is to share this. And um, I'll just reiterate, I try to share with my patients having, some practice of what I call like heart hygiene. Like, how do you really tend to this emotional quality of your heart, not just like the cardiovascular or the, heart rate variability as a sign of health, but like this emotional kind of state that we know that we can modulate and create a physiological benefit in our body. So that could be, again, there's a lot of people talking about gratitude practices. If that's where you want to start, that's great. I know you teach a lot about breath work. I think breath work is another like beautiful way to get into that calm, still place that sometimes people might have to do like the breath work before they can get into that gratitude state. So I welcome you to interact with all of that because that's only going to lead to more of what we're trying to achieve here. So I think that's the big one. And then I just want to maybe give a shout out to people. Like I hear a lot, especially in the chronic illness community, like they're very spiritual people, but they're so sick they can only get through their day. They can't even like, sometimes get a gratitude practice together or, even meditate. Like I hear all the time in my patients like there is a challenge meditating or accessing whatever that is for them when they're so sick. And that could be a lot of reasons. We could go have a whole other podcast of why. But so I try to think about those people, and there's an emerging like there's emerging field of everything that I'm talking about. Like if you start to see the body through the lens of fields, electromagnetism, light, sound, there's this kind of thought. If you just give the body coherent information, can the body start receiving that and then get stronger right within the body, so that the body can then have more energy that they can consciously do that. And so I know you also write about a light and how basically different coherent wavelengths of light, red to infrared to just getting out in the sunshine can be very energetically beneficial on an also informational level, I think, to the human body. I also love sound. I don't know how much you've done about sound education on your podcast, sorry, but
Very
there's
little.
this, yeah, there's this whole conversation about um, what we call sonocytology, which is the sounds that cells emit. And real quick, Jim Zwicky out of UCLA studied that basically the sounds of healing cell, like a healthy cell would be more like harmonious. And when cells are dying, they're like this screeching kind of disharmonic, discordant sounds. So I think bathing the body and what is basically healing sounds to you. Like everybody has an affinity to different music, but that's going to be you can get a sound bath on YouTube now. You can listen to your favorite music. All of that I think adds informational energy, to the body to create more coherence within us and more coherent fields that build upon within the body, so then people have the strength, the even mitochondrial energy, to be able to do this work. And so, again, we're our best instrument, but sometimes we have to tend to our instrument in order to allow us to really optimize it. So without going into many more, I think I'll just leave it there.
Dr. Schaffner, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and as I do with all of our conversations, but I think this one especially. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and let people know where they can get in touch with you, work with you, follow your programs, and you have an upcoming summit as well, so let people know about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ari. And it's always so lovely to be in conversation with you. So the upcoming summit is the art and science of cultivating coherence. And Roland, geeks out with all the research, his research buddies. He's like 70, has been doing this for 30 years. So all sorts of really cool research folks that I'm learning from right now as well. And then I do more like the clinical, aspects of the summit. So check that out. And then you can just go to my website, christineschaffner.com, and, I have a podcast and I have a clinic, and you can find out more about me there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend. I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Thank you, Ari.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at the Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next